tricking my slacker coworker into sabotaging himself. I've been working at this office for a few years now, and over time I've gotten used to the ebb and flow of the office culture. Most people here do their jobs, get along with one another, and leave at the end of the day without much drama. But then there's Seth. If you've ever worked in an office, you've met a Seth. He's the type of guy who seems to have figured out how to do the absolute minimum required to get by without actually getting caught for it. His strategy is simple: avoid responsibility at all costs. Somehow, he's managed to do this without facing any real consequences. And for the longest time, that someone was me. From the start, Seth had this air about him. He had the laid-back attitude that made him seem like a cool guy to everyone else. But if you looked closer, you could see how he had mastered the art of manipulation. Seth would show up late to the office, always making some excuse about traffic or the subway being delayed. And when he finally did arrive, it was never with any urgency. He'd grab his coffee, sit down at his desk, and proceeds to spend the next few hours on his phone, checking social media, scrolling through news articles, or watching videos. It was as though he had all the time in the world while the rest of us were actually working. But it wasn't just the time he wasted during the day. Seth's real skill was in passing off his work onto others. He would always volunteer for tasks that seemed simple enough, and guess who was always the one left picking up the slack? That's right, me. For months I watched as Seth took credit for the work I did. He'd send me emails asking for help with a project, only to disappear while I handled all the heavy lifting. When it came time for presentations or meetings, Seth would show up with a half-baked idea, looking to me to fix the details. Every time I tried to speak up or bring it to my manager's attention, it was always the same story. Seth had an excuse, a reason why he couldn't do the work, and somehow he would always manage to wriggle out of the consequences. It was frustrating, to say the least, especially when I felt like I was the one being taken advantage of. But things came to a head about 6 months ago when Seth made one of the biggest blunders I'd seen yet. We were assigned to work on a major report for an important client, one that would be reviewed at the highest levels of the company. The report involved complex data analysis and the preparation of detailed spreadsheets. Seth, of course, was all too happy to pass the work on to me. He asked if I could help him organize some of the raw data in Excel, promising that he'd handle the rest. I'd done this for him plenty of times before, so I didn't think much of it at first. But this time I had a feeling something was off. I noticed that the work he handed me wasn't just a small task, it was an entire mess of numbers, charts, and data points that needed to be cleaned up and organized for the final report. It was going to take hours, maybe even days, to fix. And all of it had to be ready within 2 days. He just sat there at his desk acting as though it was no big deal, as if I was somehow obligated to clean up his mess. I tried to stay calm and told him I'd help out, but I knew in that moment that something had to change. I had been putting up with this long enough. That night, as I sat in front of my computer, something clicked. I'd had enough of Seth's freeloading, and I knew that if I didn't take action, this would be yet another instance of me doing all the work while he took the credit. But I wasn't just going to let it go. I wasn't going to just let Seth mess up again and get away with it. This time, I decided I'd turn the tables on him. I remembered a conversation I'd had with Seth a few weeks earlier when we were talking about Excel. He had casually mentioned that he wasn't very good at using the program. He said he knew just enough to get by, but anything more advanced was beyond him. That was the opening I needed. I knew exactly how to make him pay for all the work he dumped on me over the past month. So I spent the next few hours embedding hidden formulas in the spreadsheets. The formulas weren't anything complex, just simple enough to mess with the numbers if someone didn't know how to spot hidden cells. They wouldn't cause the document to crash or make it completely unusable, But if someone tried to manipulate the data without knowing about the hidden cells, it would distort the numbers. I made sure it wasn't too obvious. After all, I didn't want to just sabotage the report completely. I wanted Seth to be the one who sabotaged himself. And it was important that I didn't make it so glaringly obvious that anyone would catch it immediately. The next day, I handed the spreadsheet back to Seth. He thanked me without so much as a second thought, expecting everything to be fine. And for a while everything was. Seth went about his day as usual, spending more time chatting and browsing on his phone than actually working. But when the report was due, that's when the real fun began. Seth's usual routine kicked in. He sat at his desk ready to compile everything into the final report. But as soon as he copied and pasted the data from the spreadsheet into the report, chaos ensued. The numbers didn't line up properly. Some cells were blank, while others had inexplicable errors. It was a disaster. Seth tried to fix it, but every time he fixed one section, another part of the report broke. The more he tried to salvage it, the worse it got. I watched from my desk as he grew increasingly frantic, trying to figure out what had happened. It wasn't long before the client called, furious about the report's inaccuracies. Seth was completely unprepared. His usual excuses didn't work this time. The client was demanding answers, and Seth had nothing to give. He came running to me, desperate for help. His face was pale, and he was sweating. He couldn't believe what was happening. He asked me if I could take a look and figure out what had gone wrong. I played the part perfectly. I acted confused, as if I was just as puzzled as he was. "I don't know, Seth," I said, looking at the screen. "Maybe it's a glitch. I can't really see what happened here. Have you tried refreshing the data?" Seth didn't know what to do. He spent the rest of the day trying to fix the problem, but every attempt just made things worse. I watched him struggle, and for the first time I felt a sense of satisfaction. This time it wasn't me scrambling to fix his mistakes. It was him, and I knew there was no way he could talk his way out of this one. By the time our boss caught wind of the situation, Seth was in full-blown panic mode. He tried to explain that there had been some technical error, but no one was buying it. Our boss, a no-nonsense kind of guy, wasn't impressed. He looked at Seth like he was a child who had broken something expensive. Seth was taken aside and given a stern talking to. The report was a disaster, and there was no excuse for the mess. To my surprise, our boss didn't let Seth off the hook. Instead, he was put on temporary leave without pay while the company figured out how to handle the fallout. For once, Seth couldn't wriggle out of it. He had no excuse left. And as for me, well, I couldn't help but feel a little smug. It wasn't about getting revenge, it was about standing up for myself and making sure that the lazy coworker who had been riding my coattails for so long finally had to face the consequences of his actions. And for the first time, I didn't have to do it all myself. From that point on, Seth was much more careful. He still tried his usual tactics, but I was always one step ahead. No longer would I be his scapegoat. And as for Seth, well, I think he finally learned that you can't always get away with being a slacker. After Seth's big screw-up, the office seemed to shift. There was a certain tension in the air, but not the kind I expected. For once, people were talking about him, but not in the usual way. Before all this, Seth had always been able to charm his way through things. He was good at making people laugh, at telling stories that made him seem like the life of the office, even though it was all a front. But now, as the news spread about his major blunder, the atmosphere was different. The usual murmurs around the water cooler had a new undertone of schadenfreude. People were whispering, some with genuine surprise that Seth had finally been called out, and others with that quiet satisfaction that comes when the cocky guy who always gets away with everything finally trips over his own feet. The next day at work, there was a noticeable shift in the way people interacted with me. I wasn't a hero, not exactly, but there was a new level of respect. My coworkers, who'd always seen me as the quiet, I wasn't just the one who did all the work. For Seth, I was the one who had finally put an end to his reign of laziness. People began to thank me for handling things, offering kind words of support. Some even said they were impressed with the way I managed to stay calm and collected during the whole mess despite the stress it must have caused. But there was one thing that didn't change. I still had to work with Seth, and as much as I reveled in his downfall, it wasn't without its awkwardness. Seth returned to work a few days after his temporary leave, a shell of his former self. He'd been reprimanded, yes, but he still had a job, and that's what made things uncomfortable. He was clearly trying to regain some of the office's favor, but his usual charm had lost its magic. People weren't buying his fake smile anymore. When he sat down at his desk on the first day back, he made an effort to greet everyone, but his attempts were met with forced politeness. It was as if everyone had seen behind the curtain and realized that his charm was just a mask for laziness and manipulation. It didn't take long for Seth to figure out that his usual tricks weren't going to work anymore. And while I wasn't exactly thrilled to be working next to him again, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction in watching him squirm. I had to admit, though, things weren't as smooth as I had hoped. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic speech where Seth acknowledged everything he had done wrong. Instead, he did something a lot more subtle. He went quiet, very quiet. It was almost as if he had gone into hiding within the confines of his cubicle, avoiding interaction with everyone. At first I thought it was just the fallout from the disaster, but after a few days it became clear Seth wasn't just hiding from others, he was hiding from himself. He had become a little like a ghost in the office, shuffling through his work without making any waves, without trying to draw attention to himself. The cocky attitude had evaporated, leaving behind someone who seemed small and unsure. And then there was the email. It was a Friday afternoon when I received it. Seth's name appeared in my inbox, and my first instinct was to roll my eyes. He had always been a master of passive-aggressive communication, sending emails with just enough ambiguity to avoid being blamed for anything directly. But this time the tone was different. The subject line read, "Can we talk?" I hesitated. Part of me didn't want to get involved. I had already played my hand, and Seth had already been put in his place. But another part of me was curious. What could he possibly want to say after everything that had happened? I opened the email, and my eyes scanned the text. "Hey, I know things have been pretty rough lately, and I owe you an apology. I haven't been the best coworker, and I've definitely taken advantage of your hard work more times than I should have. I get that I've messed up." I stared at the email for a moment, processing what I had just read. Was he sincere? Had the weight of his actions finally hit him? Part of me wanted to dismiss it outright. After all, this was Seth we were talking about. But the other part of me, the part that had been fed up with him for months, felt a small pang of curiosity. I wasn't going to let him off easy, but maybe this was his way of acknowledging the damage he had done. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to realize that his carefree attitude came with consequences. I decided to respond, but I wasn't going to make it easy on him. "Seth, I appreciate the apology. I'll be honest, it's been hard to work with you knowing that I've been carrying the weight of your mistakes for so long, but I'm willing to have a conversation. Just know that actions speak louder than words, and you'll need to prove that you're committed to doing things differently if we are going to move forward. Let me know when you're free." I hit send and leaned back in my chair, feeling a strange mix of relief and wariness. I didn't know what would come next. Part of me still wasn't sure if Seth had truly changed or if this was just another attempt at manipulation. But if he really was trying to make amends, I owed it to myself to at least hear him out. The following Monday, Seth came over to my desk. He seemed a little more nervous than I had ever seen him. His usual bravado was gone, replaced with a somewhat sheepish demeanor. He stood there for a moment, as if trying to find the right words before speaking. "Hey, thanks for agreeing to talk. I know I haven't been great to you. I've been thinking a lot about the whole situation, and I just wanted to let you know that I'm going to do better. I know I can't undo everything, but I'm not going to rely on you anymore. I really messed up." His words were hesitant, but there was something different about him. For the first time in a long while Seth sounded genuine. It was clear he wasn't just saying what he thought I wanted to hear. Maybe the temporary leave had been a wake-up call, or maybe he was just tired of being the office joke. Whatever it was, I could see a change in him. I nodded, taking in his words. "I appreciate the apology, Seth. I'm not saying everything's fine, but I'm willing to give you a chance to prove it. It's not just about saying you'll do better, it's about showing it through your actions. We'll see how things go, but I'm not carrying your weight anymore." Seth seemed to appreciate my honesty, and for the first time I felt like I was actually being heard. We agreed to start fresh, to work together without the underlying resentment that had been hanging between us for so long. It wasn't going to be easy, and it certainly wasn't going to be perfect. But I'd made it clear that I wouldn't tolerate being his personal safety net anymore. It was his turn to step up. As the days went on, I noticed that Seth was indeed trying. He showed up on time, did his tasks without hesitation, and most surprisingly he actually asked for help when he needed it. Not in a manipulative way, but in a genuine attempt to learn and improve. It was a far cry from the guy who had once tried to dump everything on me at the last minute. And as for me, I felt a sense of relief. Maybe the whole experience had been a lesson for both of us. Seth about the value of hard work and accountability, and me about standing up for myself and taking control of my own work-life balance. In the end, things didn't go back to the way they were. They couldn't. But for the first time I felt like I was no longer the one being taken advantage of. And I had Seth's own mistakes to thank for that.